A billionaire returned home, unannounced, and was stunned to see the black maid with his son. The unexpected homecoming revealed a scene that would forever change the course of his perfectly curated life. What he witnessed in that moment would unravel secrets buried beneath years of wealth and privilege. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The echo of John Smith's Italian leather shoes reverberated through the vast marble foyer of his Los Angeles mansion. After 14 hours of back-to-back meetings, the billionaire businessman had decided to return home unannounced, hoping to surprise his 7-year-old son Michael with a small toy dinosaur tucked in his suit pocket. The house felt unusually quiet, save for a sound that made his heart skip, the faint whimper of a child. John quickened his pace, his briefcase dropping to the floor with a thud as he rounded the corner into the main living area. The sight before him stopped him cold. Claire Johnson, the housekeeper he had employed for the past 4 years, was kneeling on his imported Persian rug. Her dark hands, trembling visibly, were pressed against Michael's forehead, her fingers stained with crimson streaks that stood out starkly against her skin. "What are you doing to him?" John's voice cut through the room like ice, his tall frame tensing as adrenaline flooded his system. Claire's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise and something else, fear. "Mr. Smith, I was just... Get away from my son," he commanded, crossing the room in 3 long strides. The businessman dropped to his knees, pulling Michael away from her and into his protective embrace. The boy's face was streaked with tears, a small gash above his right eyebrow still seeping blood. John's mind raced with terrible possibilities. Had she struck his child? Was this woman, whom he had trusted with his most precious possession, capable of such betrayal? The thought made his stomach turn. "Daddy," Meekan sobbed, his small body shaking against his father's expensive suit. Claire stood slowly, her usually confident posture now uncertain. "Sir, please, if you'd just let me explain." "I don't want explanations," John hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I want you out of this room, now." The housekeeper's face fell, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her features. Her hands, still stained with Michael's blood, hung helplessly at her sides. For 4 years, she had cared for this household with unwavering dedication, had wiped away Michael's tears when nightmares came, had kept the loneliness at bay in this cavernous mansion that had never quite felt like a home since Rachel's passing. "Sir," she tried once more. "Now," John roared, his protective instincts overwhelming any capacity for reason. Claire backed away, her dignity intact, despite the accusation hanging in the air. As she disappeared from the room, John turned his attention to his son, completely missing the desperate explanation forming on Michael's lips and the devastation in Claire's eyes as she retreated. "Get out of my house. Now." John Smith's voice sliced through the air like a steel blade, his face contorted with rage as he pointed toward the door, refusing to hear Claire Johnson's desperate attempts to explain. His mind had already constructed a narrative, one where his trusted housekeeper had harmed his only child. "But sir, please, if you'd just listen." Claire's words tumbled out, her hands still trembling. The blood on her fingers had begun to dry, making her look all the more guilty in John's eyes. "I said get out." The businessman's voice echoed through the marble foyer of his Los Angeles mansion. "Pack your things and be gone within the hour." Michael clung to his father's leg, his small face streaked with tears, a bandage hastily applied to his forehead. The boy tried to speak, his words coming out in confused fragments. "Daddy, I was just..." The stairs. Claire didn't, but his father wasn't listening. The billionaire had made his judgment, and nothing would sway him. Claire looked at Michael one last time, her eyes filled with hurt and concern, before turning away. Her footsteps were heavy as she climbed the stairs to gather her belongings, each step a painful reminder of the 5 years she had devoted to this household. Within 45 minutes, she was gone. That evening, silence descended on the mansion like a shroud. John paced the spacious living room, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floors. The house felt different, emptier somehow, despite its grandeur. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it absently. Michael had cried himself to sleep, refusing dinner and the comfort of his father's arms. The child's rejection stung, But John convinced himself he'd done the right thing. How could he allow someone who had hurt his son to remain under his roof? Yet as midnight approached, doubt began to creep in. He found himself pausing outside the kitchen, half expecting to hear Claire's soft humming as she prepared the next day's meals. The absence of her laughter, the missing scent of her cinnamon tea, these things created a void he hadn't anticipated. John stopped at Michael's bedroom door, peering in at his sleeping son. In the moonlight, the boy looked so much like Rachel, his late mother. What would she have done in this situation? Would she have listened before acting? The billionaire retreated to his study, pouring another drink. He refused to acknowledge the warmth Claire had brought to their lives, or how much they had come to depend on her presence. Instead, he hardened his resolve, telling himself that tomorrow he would find a replacement, someone better, someone safer. But as he stared out at the Los Angeles skyline, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. Days turned into weeks, and Michael Smith's spirit withered like a flower deprived of sunlight. The once vibrant 5-year-old now moved through the mansion's vast rooms like a ghost, his small shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Without Claire Johnson's gentle laughter echoing through the halls, and her nightly ritual of animated bedtime stories, the house felt cavernous and cold. John tried everything money could buy to fill the void. A parade of professional nannies came and went, each more qualified than the last on paper, but none possessing that special warmth his son desperately needed. The businessman brought home extravagant toys that remained untouched in their packaging, collecting dust in the corner of Michael's bedroom. "Look what Daddy got you," John would say, presenting another electronic gadget or stuffed animal with forced enthusiasm. Michael would nod politely, but his eyes, so much like his mother Rachel's, remained dull and distant. At breakfast, the child would stare at his cereal, pushing it around the bowl until it grew soggy. "Don't you want something else?" John would ask, his voice tinged with desperation. "I can have the chef make anything you want." But Michael would just shake his head, and eventually excuse himself, leaving his meal untouched. The guilt began to gnaw at John, a persistent ache that intensified with each passing day. He found himself standing in the doorway of the kitchen, half expecting to hear Claire's humming as she prepared Michael's favorite peanut butter and banana sandwiches, cut into perfect triangles. The silence that greeted him instead was deafening. At night, when Michael had nightmares which happened with increasing frequency, John would rush to his son's room, only to fumble awkwardly with comforting words. He missed Claire's steady hand in these moments of crisis, where she knew exactly what to say and do to calm the boy's fears. Even in his Los Angeles office, surrounded by spreadsheets and business proposals, John caught himself thinking about her. He remembered how she spoke to Michael with unwavering patience, never raising her voice even when the child was being difficult. She had a gift for explaining complex things in ways his son could understand, something John realized he had never mastered himself. One evening, as he tucked Michael in, the boy clutched his favorite storybook to his chest and whispered, "Claire did the voices better." The simple statement hit John like a physical blow, forcing him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps he had made a terrible mistake. John Smith sat on the edge of Michael's bed, watching his son push dinosaur figures across the blue comforter. The boy had barely spoken 3 words since Claire Johnson's departure. The mansion felt emptier somehow, despite the parade of new nannies John had hired to fill the void. "Do you like Miss Peterson?" John asked, referring to the latest caretaker, a perfectly qualified woman with impeccable references, who somehow still couldn't coax a smile from Michael. His son shrugged, eyes downcast. "She doesn't read the voices right." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. The businessman who commanded boardrooms found himself completely lost with his own 5-year-old. He missed the easy rhythm Claire had established, the way she'd known exactly what Michael needed, without asking. "Would you like to tell me what happened that day with Claire?" John ventured carefully, the question he'd been avoiding for weeks. Michael's small hands stilled on the plastic Tyrannosaurus. In the dim glow of the nightlight, John could see his son's lower lip trembling. "I was running," Michael whispered, his voice so soft John had to lean closer. "In the hallway, Claire told me to be careful, but I didn't listen." John felt his heart constrict. He'd never even asked. "I fell, Daddy. Hit my head on the table corner." Michael's fingers unconsciously touched the healing cut on his forehead. Claire tried to help me. She was scared and crying. The words hung in the air between them, soft and devastating. John felt the weight of truth crush against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Everything he'd assumed, everything he'd acted on without question, crumbled away, leaving only the raw reality of his mistake. "She didn't hurt me," Michael continued, tears welling in his eyes. "She was making it better when you came home." Shame flooded John's face, hot and undeniable. He'd seen blood, heard crying, and immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. He hadn't asked questions, hadn't given Claire, who had cared for Michael with unwavering devotion for 3 years, even a moment to explain. "I miss her," Michael said, a single tear tracking down his cheek. "She always made the bad dreams go away." John gathered his son into his arms, his own vision blurring. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered into Michael's hair. "I made a terrible mistake." The businessman who prided himself on careful decision-making had acted on prejudice and fear. He'd fired a woman who'd become family, leaving his son to bear the emotional cost of his rashness. The truth was written in Michael's haunted eyes, in the silence that had descended over their home. John knew then he had to make this right for Michael, for Claire, and for himself. John Smith's thumb hovered over Claire Johnson's contact for the 20th time that day. The mansion felt cavernous without her presence, each room echoing with memories of her gentle humming and Michael's laughter. He pressed call, listening to the ring with a tightness in his chest that had become all too familiar. "Please pick up," he whispered, pacing across his office. Once again her voicemail greeted him, her recorded voice the only part of her still accessible to him. The businessman slumped into his leather chair, staring at the family photo on his desk himself. Michael and Rachel. His late wife's smile seemed to hold a question he couldn't answer. What would Rachel think of how he'd treated Claire? 3 days had passed since Michael's revelation, and John's shame had only deepened. The image of Claire on her knees, desperately trying to help his son while blood stained her hands, now haunted him. He had misread everything, allowing his worst instincts to judge her without a moment's hesitation. "Claire," he began after the beep, his voice unsteady, "I know you have every right to ignore these calls. What I did was unforgivable." He paused, swallowing hard. "I judged you without listening. I acted without thinking." The words felt inadequate against the magnitude of his mistake. Outside his window, the Los Angeles skyline glittered indifferently. John had built empires and negotiated billion-dollar deals, yet he couldn't fix this most important relationship. Later that evening, he tried again. This time, exhaustion stripped away his usual composure. "Michael misses you terribly," he admitted, his voice cracking. "He barely prays. He won't let anyone else read to him." John took a deep breath. "And I miss you too. The house isn't the same without you." Pride had always been John's armor, but now it tasted bitter on his tongue. He offered no excuses in his messages, no justifications, only raw truth. He needed her back, not just for Michael's sake, but for his own. That night, unable to sleep, he recorded one final message. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Claire, but Michael does. He needs you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "We both do." John set his phone down, knowing that all his wealth and influence meant nothing in this situation. For the first time in years, he felt truly powerless. The fate of his household, of his family, rested in the hands of the woman he had wronged, and all he could do was wait and hope she might find it in her heart to return. Michael Smith had been watching his father's futile attempts to reach Claire for days. The 6-year-old boy understood more than John Smith realized. Each night, he'd hear his father's heavy sighs after another unanswered call, another voicemail that disappeared into silence. The mansion felt empty without Claire's warm presence, and Michael missed her bedtime stories and the way she'd cut his sandwiches into dinosaur shapes. One evening, while John was distracted with work documents spread across his office desk, Michael saw his opportunity. He crept into the room, small fingers quickly snatching his father's smartphone from the edge of the mahogany surface. The child retreated to his bedroom, clutching the device like a precious treasure. With determined concentration, Michael navigated to the recent calls. Claire Johnson's name appeared repeatedly at the top of the list. His finger hovered for just a moment before pressing the call button. When her voicemail answered, Tears welled in his eyes. "Claire, it's Michael," he whispered, voice breaking. "I miss you so much. Daddy's sad too, but he doesn't say it. I told him I fell and you tried to help me. Please come back. Nobody makes pancakes like you do." His small voice cracked. "I need you. We both do." The child ended the call and carefully returned the phone to his father's desk, the billionaire none the wiser about his son's intervention. Miles away in her modest South Los Angeles apartment, Claire was preparing for bed when her phone buzzed with a notification. She had been ignoring John's calls systematically, the memory of his cold dismissal still burning fresh. The injustice of being thrown out without a chance to explain had left a wound that hadn't begun to heal. Yet when she saw Michael's name on the voicemail, something broke inside her. Claire sat on the edge of her bed and pressed play, her hand trembling slightly. The boy's tearful plea washed over her, each word tugging at heartstrings she'd tried to harden. "Oh, Michael," she whispered to the empty room. Claire closed her eyes, conflicting emotions battling within her. The love she felt for the child was undeniable. In the 3 years she'd worked for the Smith family, Michael had become almost like her own. But the way John had treated her, the immediate assumption of guilt, the cold dismissal after years of loyal service, she replayed the message twice more, each time feeling her resolve weaken. The housekeeper wiped away a tear, knowing that despite everything, she couldn't simply abandon the boy who needed her. The question remained, could she forgive his father? After 3 weeks of unanswered calls, Claire Johnson finally responded to John's messages. Her text was brief and direct. She would meet him, but not at his mansion where the painful memory still lingered. Instead, she named the South Los Angeles Community Center, a place where she volunteered 3 afternoons a week. John pulled his lowly sedan into the center's cracked parking lot, feeling immediately out of place. His Italian suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the weathered building with its faded mural of children holding hands across a rainbow. He hesitated before stepping out, suddenly aware of how his wealth marked him as an outsider here. Inside, the center pulsed with energy. Children darted between tables, their laughter echoing off walls adorned with colorful artwork. Volunteers moved purposefully through the chaos, distributing snacks and guiding activities. And there, in the center of it all, stood Claire. She wore simple jeans and a t-shirt with the center's logo, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Yet she commanded the space with quiet authority, directing volunteers with gentle gestures and soothing a crying child with practiced ease. 3 young boys raced to her side, tugging at her hands and sharing excited stories that made her laugh. The sound, John realized he'd rarely heard in his home. "Miss Claire, is that man looking for you?" The small girl pointed toward John, who remained frozen near the entrance. Claire turned, her smile fading slightly as she nodded to John. "I'll be right with you," she called, before kneeling to finish a conversation with the children around her. John watched, transfixed. This wasn't the Claire he thought he knew, the quiet, efficient housekeeper who moved through his mansion like a shadow. Here she was vibrant, respected, loved. People sought her advice. Children gravitated to her warmth, and elderly volunteers nodded deferentially when she spoke. "They depend on me here," she said simply when she finally approached him. "Not just for cleaning or cooking, but for who I am." The businessman felt something shift inside him, a realization that he'd never truly seen her before. In his home, he'd viewed her through the narrow lens of her role. Here, surrounded by a community that valued her wisdom and heart, John saw Claire as a leader, a nurturer, a woman of substance beyond her service to his family. "I had no idea," he admitted, his voice softer than he intended. "No," she replied, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time since she'd entered his employ 3 years ago. "You didn't ask." Claire Johnson crossed her arms, her eyes challenging John Smith in a way no employee had ever dared before. "If you want to understand, you need to experience it," she said, gesturing around the bustling community center in South Los Angeles. "Volunteer here, not as a billionaire writing checks, but as a person serving others." John hesitated, his designer suit suddenly feeling like armor in this unfamiliar territory. Children darted between worn tables while adults from all walks of life chatted in the community kitchen. This world, just miles from his mansion, Might as well have been another planet. I don't know the first thing about, he began. That's the point, Claire interrupted. You'll learn. The following day, John arrived in jeans and a plain t-shirt, feeling strangely vulnerable without his usual trappings of wealth. Claire handed him an apron without ceremony and pointed him toward a stack of dishes. For 3 hours he washed plates alongside a teenager who'd recently escaped homelessness, listening as the young man shared dreams of college that seemed impossibly distant. By the second week, John had graduated to serving food. His hands, more accustomed to signing contracts than ladling soup, developed blisters. Yet he found himself returning, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. He watched Claire move through the space with natural authority, respected not for her wealth but for her genuine care. "You're getting better at this," she remarked one evening as they wiped down tables together after closing, "though your mopping technique still needs work." John laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "My board of directors would be shocked to see me now." "And what would they think?" Claire asked, her voice careful. John paused, considering. "They wouldn't understand what I'm beginning to see." What he couldn't articulate was how the gratitude in people's eyes when he served them food filled a void that business success never had. How listening to stories of struggle and resilience made his own problems seem smaller. How watching Claire teach children to read with infinite patience made him question everything he thought he knew about strength. In the mansion's echoing halls, John had been powerful but isolated. Here, among strangers becoming friends, he found connection. When an elderly woman squeezed his hand and thanked him for listening to her story, something long dormant stirred in his chest. "You're different here," Michael observed during his first visit to the center, his small hand in his father. John looked down at his son, then across the room at Claire, directing volunteers with quiet confidence. "I'm trying to be," he answered honestly. The fragile bridge of trust between John Smith and Claire Johnson was slowly being rebuilt. Their weekly meetings at the community center had evolved from awkward silences to meaningful conversations. John had surprised himself by finding genuine fulfillment in helping others, and Claire was cautiously allowing herself to believe in his transformation. One Wednesday afternoon, as Claire organized supplies for the children's art program, the center's door swung open. She looked up, expecting to see John, but instead found herself staring into a face she hadn't seen in 15 years. Her father, Robert Johnson. "Claire," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The years had weathered him, gray-streaked his temples, and deep lines framed his eyes. "I've been looking for you." Claire froze, the paintbrushes in her hand clattering to the floor. The children around her sensed the tension and quieted their chatter. "I found this while clearing out the old house," Robert continued, extending a yellowed envelope. "It's from your mother. She wrote it before she passed." Claire's hands trembled as she took the letter, her mother's handwriting instantly recognizable. The pain of abandonment, of being left alone at 17 when her father disappeared after her mother's funeral, surged through her body like an electric current. 15 years, she whispered, anger and hurt competing in her voice. "You disappeared for 15 years. Robert's shoulders slumped. "I know. I have no excuses, only regrets." John arrived just then, stopping short at the doorway as he assessed the situation. Claire's face had drained of color, and the stranger standing before her seemed to be the cause. Protective instinct flared within him. "Everything okay here?" John asked, moving to Claire's side. Claire introduced them with a hollow voice. "John, this is my father. Robert, this is..." As Claire excused herself to read the letter in private, John found himself in the uncomfortable position of making small talk with the man who had caused Claire so much pain. Robert spoke of mistakes, of years lost to grief and alcohol, of the long road to sobriety that had led him back to his daughter. Later that evening, John drove Claire home in silence. When they finally parked outside her apartment building, she spoke. "He wants another chance," she said, staring through the windshield. After everything, John thought of his own mistake with Claire, how quickly he had judged her, how deeply he had hurt her. "What will you do?" he asked. Claire turned to him, her eyes reflecting the streetlights. "I don't know. Part of me wants to slam the door forever. But another part wants closure," John finished for her. Yes, for the first time, John truly understood how difficult forgiveness could be. He had asked Claire for a second chance, and now her father was asking the same of her. The parallel wasn't lost on him, as he silently rooted for her to find peace, whatever her decision might be. The whispers started at the Westside Children's Hospital fundraiser. John Smith stood near the bar, his attention fixed on his smartphone as he scrolled through photos Claire had sent of Michael's art project. A smile touched his lips, unaware of Linda Brown watching from across the room, her eyes narrowing as she leaned toward her circle of socialites. "Have you heard about John's situation?" Linda's voice carried just enough to reach nearby ears, but not his. "That housekeeper has completely wrapped him around her finger." Poor Rachel would be devastated. Within days, the rumors spread through Los Angeles elite circles. John noticed the lingering glances and conversations that stopped when he approached. Yet rather than retreat, he made a bold decision. The annual Palmer Foundation Gala was approaching, one of the most prestigious charity events of the season, and John decided to invite Claire Johnson as his guest. "It's just a stuffy party with overpriced food," he explained, standing in the kitchen of his mansion, while Michael colored at the table. "But I'd like you to come with me." Claire hesitated, her hands pausing over the dishes she was drying. "Are you sure that's wise?" "People talk, John. Let them," he replied with newfound conviction. The night of the gala arrived with a flurry of anticipation. Claire stepped into the grand ballroom beside John, stunning in a midnight blue gown that contrasted with the billionaire's classic tuxedo. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Claire felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, some curious, others disapproving. They made it halfway across the room before Linda intercepted them, champagne flute in hand, and a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "John, darling, how wonderful to see you." She air-kissed his cheek before turning to Claire. "And you brought your help. How progressive." Claire maintained her composure, extending her hand. "Claire Johnson, we've never formally met." Linda barely touched her fingers. "Quite. Tell me, do you find it difficult to navigate these events? The etiquette must be so foreign to you." The businessman stiffened beside Claire, but she spoke before he could intervene. "Actually, Mrs. Brown, I find sincerity is the most valuable etiquette in any setting." The socialite's smile faltered. "Well, I suppose when one has nothing to lose, boldness comes easily." As Linda glided away, Claire felt the sting of the encounter settle in her chest. Throughout the evening she endured sidelong glances and whispered comments. A waiter accidentally spilled water on her dress. A board member's wife loudly questioned the security at the entrance. John witnessed it all, his jaw tightening with each slight. When he found Claire alone on the terrace, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, something fundamental shifted inside him. John Smith's jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold. Linda Brown's words hung in the air like poison, her smile never reaching her eyes as she loudly questioned Claire's presence at such an exclusive gathering. The ballroom seemed to freeze, crystal glasses paused mid-toast as guests turned to stare. "That's enough," John said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He placed a protective hand on Claire's shoulder, but she gently moved away. "I can handle this," Claire Johnson whispered, her spine straightening as she faced Linda directly. With quiet dignity that commanded more respect than any outburst could, she simply nodded at the woman and walked away, refusing to engage in a battle that would only entertain the onlookers. Later that night, back at the mansion, Claire sat in the kitchen, her gala dress exchanged for comfortable clothes, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea. John paced, still fuming about Linda's behavior. "I should have done more," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I should have thrown her out." Claire looked up at him, exhaustion evident in her eyes, and what would that have accomplished? More gossip? More headline? The businessman stopped pacing, truly seeing her weariness for the first time. "You don't understand what it's like," she continued softly. "Every day I fight battles you'll never have to face. The way people look at me when I walk into a store, the assumptions they make, the way they clutch their bags tighter." John sat across from her, silent and listening. "Tonight wasn't new, John. It was just more public." She set down her mug. "And tomorrow, I'll wake up and face it all again, because that's what I've always done." The weight of her words settled between them. In that moment, John realized how sheltered he'd been by his wealth and privilege. He'd never had to prove his right to exist in spaces. He'd never been questioned or humiliated simply for being. "I want to stand with you," he said finally. "Not just here behind closed doors, but out there, where it matters." Claire studied his face. "You don't know what you're saying. Your business partners, your social circle, they'll turn on you." "Let them," John replied. A certainty growing inside him, he reached across the table, taking her hand. "Some things are worth more than comfort or reputation." For the first time that evening, Claire smiled. A small, tentative curve of her lips that held more hope than either of them had felt in years. "We'll see," she said, but her fingers tightened around his. The consequences of John Smith's public stance alongside Claire came swiftly and mercilessly. 3 major business partners withdrew from multi-million-dollar deals overnight, citing strategic realignment in carefully worded emails that barely masked their true concerns. The Los Angeles business community, once John's stronghold, now buzzed with whispers about his questionable judgment. His smartphone vibrated constantly with notifications from business news outlets. Headlines from financial blogs speculated about his downward spiral and distracted leadership, with one particularly scathing article suggesting he had abandoned his fiduciary responsibilities in favor of personal entanglement. The stock in his primary company dipped 8% in a single trading day. "You need to think about what you're doing," warned Richard, his longest-standing board member, during a tense call. "This isn't just about you anymore. There are shareholders, employees, legacies at stake." Even James, who had been his friend since college, left a voicemail urging him to get his priorities straight and remember who he really was. The subtext was clear. The wealthy businessman was expected to maintain certain boundaries, and he had crossed them spectacularly. Linda Brown worked tirelessly behind the scenes, John discovered, whispering to anyone who would listen about Claire's suspicious influence over him and Michael. At the country club, his regular table suddenly became unavailable. Invitations to elite gatherings dwindled to nothing. But something unexpected had happened to John amid this social and professional exile. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't care about their approval. The mansion that had once felt like a monument to his success now seemed hollow compared to the vibrant energy of the community center in South Los Angeles. He spent his mornings with Michael, watching his son's eyes light up as they drove together to meet Claire. The 3 of them worked side by side, painting walls, organizing donations, and planning programs. The businessman who once delegated every task now found satisfaction in the simplest physical labor, laying bricks for the new playground, installing shelves in the reading room, fixing leaky faucets in the bathroom. "Dad, look," Michael would call out several times a day, prouder of his father's attention than any expensive toy he'd ever received. In the evenings, Claire would sometimes catch John staring at his silent device, momentarily lost in thought about what he'd left behind. But then he would look up, see her and Michael, and his expression would clear, as if remembering that he had finally found something worth more than everything he was losing. Rain drummed mend in the windows of the mansion, casting a gray veil over the Los Angeles afternoon. Michael Smith sat cross-legged on the carpet of his room, surrounded by a fortress of picture books. The 7-year-old had been unusually quiet since breakfast, his small fingers carefully turning pages of stories that once brought him comfort. It was in The Brave Little Sailor, his favorite storybook, that Michael found it, a cream-colored envelope tucked between the final pages. His name was written on the front in elegant handwriting he didn't recognize. Curious, he pulled out the letter inside. "Claire," he called out, his voice echoing down the hallway. "I found something." Claire Johnson appeared in the doorway moments later, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of the envelope. "What's that you've got there, sweetie?" "It has my name on it," Michael explained, holding it up. "But I can't read all the words inside." Claire sat beside him, gently taking the letter. As her eyes scanned the first few lines, she inhaled sharply. "This is from your mother," she whispered. "We should show this to your father." John Smith was in his home office when they knocked. The businessman looked up from his computer, his expression softening at the sight of them. "What's going on?" "Michael found something," Claire said quietly, handing him the letter. "It's from Rachel." John's hands trembled as he took the paper. Rachel's words flowed across the page, words of profound love for her son, of the pain of knowing she wouldn't see him grow up, and finally a message for John himself. She spoke of her hope that he would find happiness again, that he wouldn't close his heart to love, wherever it might come from. "She wanted you to be happy, Daddy," Michael said, climbing onto his father's lap. John couldn't speak. Tears streamed down his face, dropping onto the letter. For 3 years since Rachel's death, he had lived with guilt. Guilt for moving forward, guilt for the feelings growing between him and Claire. Now it was as if Rachel herself had reached across time to free him. Claire stood awkwardly by the door, uncertain if she should leave them to this private moment. But John looked up, his eyes finding hers through his tears. "Stay," he whispered, extending his hand. She crossed the room and took it, her own eyes glistening. Michael wrapped his small arms around them both, creating a circle that felt for the first time complete. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last barriers between them. In Rachel's final gift, they had found permission to become the family they were already becoming, different than planned, unexpected, but no less real. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the front door of John Smith's mansion. Claire Johnson found it while sweeping the foyer, an envelope with no return address, containing a single page filled with hateful words and thinly veiled threats. Her hands trembled as she read the message warning her to know her place and stay away from the Smith family. When John discovered what had happened, his face darkened with fury. Within hours, 3 more messages appeared in his email inbox, each more vicious than the last. The anonymous sender questioned his judgment, his parenting, and his relationship with the help. One message even included photos of Claire and Michael at the park, proving they were being watched. "I'm calling the police," John declared, his protective instincts flaring as he paced the living room. "And I'm hiring additional security immediately." Claire sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid but dignified. "I've dealt with hatred before," she said finally. "I won't let nameless cowards chase me away from people I care about." Despite her brave words, John noticed how she double-checked the locks that night and jumped at unexpected sounds. The housekeeper, who had faced Linda Brown's cruelty with such composure, now glanced nervously out windows, her usual confidence shaken. Within days, security cameras were installed throughout the property, and a guard patrolled the perimeter. John insisted on driving Claire himself whenever she left the mansion, unwilling to let her face potential danger alone. Their routines changed, fewer public outings, more caution about sharing their whereabouts online. "Are we in trouble?" Michael asked one evening, his small voice cutting through the tension that had settled over dinner. Claire and John exchanged glances across the table. "No, sweetheart," Claire assured him, reaching for his hand. "Sometimes people say unkind things when they don't understand." The next morning they found Michael hunched over the coffee table, surrounded by crayons and paper. He'd drawn 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall with a tie, one with curly hair, and one small figure in the middle. "This is us," he explained proudly. "We're happy." John hung the picture on the refrigerator, and soon others joined it, drawings of their home, the community center, and imagined adventures together. Michael's artwork transformed the mansion's cold surfaces into a gallery of hope. "We won't let fear win," Claire whispered to John one night as they stood together in the kitchen, surrounded by Michael's colorful creations. "Not when we've come this far." John nodded, his hand finding hers in the dim light. Together, he promised, whatever comes next. The lawsuit landed on Claire Johnson's desk like a grenade. Linda Brown had filed defamation charges, claiming Claire had spread malicious lies about her at the charity gala. The court summons, printed on crisp legal paper, trembled in Claire's hands as she read the allegations, each word more outrageous than the last. "This is absurd," Claire whispered, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. She had barely spoken to anyone at the gala, except to defend herself after Linda's cutting remarks about her appropriate place in society. When the news broke, it spread through Los Angeles like wildfire. Local papers ran headlines questioning Claire's character, while social media buzzed with speculation. Overnight, her private life became public property, dissected by strangers who knew nothing of her truth. "They can't do this to you," John said, his jaw tight with anger, as he paced across the living room of his mansion. I'll hire the best legal team in the country. Claire shook her head. I need to fight this my way, John. With truth. The courthouse steps became their second home as preliminary hearings began. Claire arrived each morning with her head held high despite the cameras and whispers. John Smith walked beside her, their shoulders nearly touching, his presence a declaration to everyone watching that she would not face this alone. Inside the courtroom, Linda sat with her expensive legal team, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the table. The socialite's testimony painted Claire as an opportunist who had slandered her good name to curry favor with John. Mr. Johnson deliberately spread rumors questioning my character and my relationship with the late Rachel Smith. Linda testified, her voice breaking at the strategic mention of John's deceased wife. When Claire's turn came to testify, she spoke with quiet dignity. I never spoke ill of Brown to anyone. The only words exchanged between us were when she suggested I didn't belong at the gala because of my background. The grueling cross-examination lasted hours. Claire's past was scrutinized, her motives questioned. Yet with each answer, her unwavering honesty shone through, touching something in the courtroom observers. Unexpectedly, 3 other guests from the gala came forward, offering testimony that corroborated Claire's account. One woman, a longtime donor to John's charitable foundations, described overhearing Linda's discriminatory comments. I've stayed silent too long about behaviors like this in our social circles, the woman stated firmly. As weeks of legal battles wore on, Claire's resilience never faltered. Each evening she would return to the mansion where Michael waited, drawing pictures of superheroes who looked suspiciously like his father and Claire. Are you winning? The boy would ask. Claire would smile, knowing that regardless of the court's decision, she had already won something far more valuable: the courage to stand in her truth, no matter who tried to silence her. The lawsuit was finally winding down when the doorbell rang on a quiet Tuesday morning. John Smith opened the door to find 2 police officers and a woman with a clipboard, who introduced herself as a social worker from Child Protective Services. We've received a report concerning your son's welfare, she stated, her voice clinical and detached. John's stomach dropped as they presented paperwork authorizing them to inspect the home and interview Michael. Claire, who had been preparing breakfast, appeared in the hallway, her face paling as she understood what was happening. This is ridiculous, John protested, but stepped aside. He knew the drill: resist, and they'd only return with more authority. The next 3 hours were excruciating. The social worker examined Michael's bedroom, photographed the contents of their refrigerator, and inspected the medicine cabinets. She questioned the boy alone, her gentle but probing questions designed to uncover any signs of mistreatment. Who do you think reported us? Claire whispered when they had a moment alone in the kitchen. John ran his hand through his hair. Linda Brown, he said, naming his late wife's former colleague. This has her fingerprints all over it. The investigation dredged up painful memories for John. He remembered the day he'd wrongfully accused Claire, how quickly he'd jumped to conclusions without evidence. The shame of that moment revisited him, now as strangers scrutinized his parenting. They asked if you ever hit me, Daddy, Michael said that evening, curled against his father on the sofa. I told them you never ever would. Claire sat beside them, her hand steady on John's shoulder. We'll get through this, she assured him. The truth is on our side. Over the following weeks, the investigation intensified. School records were reviewed, neighbors interviewed. John's business associates were questioned about his temperament. The businessman who had once commanded boardrooms now felt powerless, his reputation and family hanging in the balance. Claire proved to be his anchor. She organized their documentation, prepared Michael for follow-up interviews, and never once wavered in her support. You're a good father, she reminded him each night. Don't let them make you doubt that. The turning point came when Michael, with a courage beyond his years, spoke clearly and confidently to the lead investigator. My dad and Claire love me, he stated. They never hurt me. The only time I got hurt was when I fell, and Claire tried to help me. 6 weeks after it began, the case was closed. No evidence of abuse or neglect was found. As the social worker delivered the news, John noticed something in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps the anonymous tip had been motivated by something other than Ven. That night, the 3 of them sat together, exhausted but relieved. They had weathered another storm, their bond not weakened but strengthened by the ordeal. Claire Johnson sat across from her father at a small cafe near the community center, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Robert's weathered face held a mixture of hope and apprehension as he shared stories of Claire's childhood memories she had almost forgotten. "I kept every drawing you made," Robert confessed, pulling out a worn envelope from his jacket. "Even during those years away, I carried them everywhere." Claire's throat tightened as she leafed through crayon drawings from 20 years ago. The anger she'd harbored for so long began to soften around the edges, not disappearing but transforming into something she could finally carry without pain. "I'm not asking you to forget," her father said, his voice breaking. "Just maybe to start again." Their reconciliation wasn't a straight line. Some days old resentments flared when Robert mentioned Claire's mother or made excuses for his absence. Other days they discovered unexpected common ground, their shared love of jazz music, their stubborn determination, their way of laughing with their whole bodies. John Smith witnessed this healing from a respectful distance, understanding that some journeys couldn't be rushed or fixed with wealth. He supported Claire with quiet gestures, adjusting his schedule when she needed time with Robert, listening as she processed decades of complicated emotion. "I never thought I could forgive him," Claire admitted to John one evening as they walked through his garden. "But watching you change, seeing how you faced your mistakes with Michael, it gave me courage." Meanwhile, Michael observed everything with the unfiltered wisdom of childhood. The boy who had once retreated into silence now asked questions that cut through adult pretenses. "Are you still mad at Grandpa Robert?" he asked Claire one afternoon while they baked cookies in John's expansive kitchen. Claire paused, flour dusting her hands. "Sometimes, but I'm learning that loving someone doesn't mean you never get mad at them." Michael nodded seriously. "Like when Dad thought you hurt me, but then he said sorry and now you love each other." His simple framing of complex adult relationships made both Claire and John exchange glances over his head, amazed at how children could distill life's complications into essential truths. As spring turned to summer, Michael's confidence bloomed alongside the garden they planted together. His nightmares grew less frequent, his laughter came more easily. The boy became the unexpected bridge between past wounds and future possibilities, reminding the adults around him that growth required both honesty and forgiveness. In this new family they were creating undefined by traditional boundaries, but stronger for it. Michael found the security he craved, while Claire and John discovered that healing often came from unexpected sources. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers hung colorful banners across freshly painted walls. John Smith stood back, surveying the transformation with quiet pride. What had once been a dilapidated building in South Los Angeles now gleamed with new purpose, a testament to what determination and resources could accomplish when properly directed. Claire Johnson moved through the space with natural authority, directing the placement of tables and checking off items on her clipboard. Children darted between adults, their excited voices filling the air with anticipation for tomorrow's grand opening. The businessman caught himself smiling as he watched her. This woman who had changed everything. "Mr. Smith, where do you want these books?" called Robert Johnson, his arms laden with donations for the reading corner. The relationship between father and daughter remained a work in progress, but Robert's dedication to the center had become his way of making amends. "Just follow Claire's instructions," John replied. "She's the expert here." The grand opening exceeded all expectation. Hundreds from the community gathered to celebrate, the center's doors thrown wide to welcome everyone. Tables overflowed with home-cooked dishes, music pulsed from speakers, and laughter echoed from every corner. Michael raced around with new friends, his face alight with joy, a dramatic contrast to the withdrawn child of months before. Linda Brown made a brief, uncomfortable appearance, her curiosity apparently stronger than her disapproval. She departed quickly, but not before Claire graciously offered her a plate of food, a small victory that made John's heart swell with admiration. As evening approached, Claire found John sitting alone on a bench outside. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, settling beside him. "Just thinking about how different everything is now," he said. "Not just this place, but my home too." And it was true. The mansion that had once felt like a mausoleum now pulsed with life. Michael's artwork, decorated refrigerator doors and hallways, the kitchen regularly filled with the aroma of Claire's baking. Laughter had replaced the oppressive silence that had lingered since Rachel's death. "I never thought I'd say this," John admitted, "but I actually enjoy finding toy cars under the sofa and flour on the countertops." Claire's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Home isn't about the building," she said softly. "It's about the people who fill it." As they returned inside, John watched Michael demonstrating a handshake to Robert, the boy's infectious giggles drawing smiles from everyone nearby. The businessman realized that in trying to save others, he had ultimately saved himself, finding family, purpose and love in places he'd never thought to look. The Los Angeles Annual Community Forum had always been a prestigious event, but this year carried special significance. Claire Johnson stood backstage, her heart pounding against her ribs as she reviewed her notes one last time. When the organizer had asked her to deliver the closing speech, she'd nearly refused. Public speaking had never been her strength. "You've got this," John Smith whispered, squeezing her hand. His presence beside her, once unimaginable, now felt like the most natural thing in the world. Michael stood on her other side, his small face beaming with pride. "Ladies and gentlemen, our closing speaker," announced the moderator, and suddenly Claire was walking toward the podium, the spotlight finding her as she took her place before hundreds of attentive faces. Among them sat Robert Johnson, her father nodding encouragement from the third row. "I stand before you as someone who has lived in the shadows," Claire began, her voice initially soft but growing stronger with each word. "A housekeeper, a caretaker, someone easy to overlook or dismiss with a single glance." The audience grew silent as she recounted the moment John had accused her of hurting Michael, the humiliation at the gala when Linda Brown had loudly questioned why a servant was attending, and the countless small indignities she'd weathered throughout her life. "These weren't just personal slights," she continued. "They reflect the invisible barriers we build around each other based on appearance, occupation, or background." Claire's gaze found Linda in the audience, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The lawsuit had been settled weeks ago, but the tension remained palpable. "Yet I also stand before you as living proof that people can change," she said, her eyes moving to John. "That when we truly see each other beyond our assumptions and fears, transformation becomes possible." The businessman's eyes glistened with unshed tears as Claire spoke of the community center, now thriving thanks to his support, and how working alongside those he once would have avoided had revealed his true character. "The greatest barrier to justice isn't always hatred," Claire's voice resonated through the hall. "Sometimes it's simply our unwillingness to be uncomfortable, to question our certainties, to admit when we've been wrong." By the time she finished, many were openly weeping. The applause began slowly, then built to a thunderous standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Michael jumped up and down, clapping wildly for the woman who had become his second mother. As Claire stepped away from the podium, she was no longer just a housekeeper who had overcome adversity. She had become a voice for countless others, her story echoing far beyond the forum's walls. John Smith stood on the freshly painted steps of the South Los Angeles Community Center, his hand resting gently on Michael's shoulder. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground where children laughed and played, a sound that had become the soundtrack to their new life. Claire Johnson stood beside them, her eyes reflecting pride as she watched volunteers arranging tables for the evening's neighborhood dinner. "We did it," Claire whispered, her voice carrying the weight of their journey. John nodded, remembering the man he'd been just 1 year ago, isolated in his marble mansion, walled off by wealth and assumptions. That man would never have recognized the person he'd become. The businessman who once measured success in acquisitions and profit margins now found fulfillment in the simple act of belonging. Michael tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing excitedly toward a mural they'd helped paint on the center's wall, 3 figures holding hands beneath a rainbow. "That's us," the boy said, his voice strong and clear, no longer carrying the hesitation that had marked his speech after that fateful day. Claire smiled and knelt beside him. "It certainly is, sweetheart." She brushed his hair back, the gesture so natural now that none of them remembered a time when it hadn't been part of their daily rhythm. They had weathered storms that would have broken lesser bonds. The lawsuit from Linda had eventually collapsed under the weight of its own malice. Robert Johnson had become a regular visitor to their home, his relationship with his daughter healing with each passing month. Even some of John's former business associates had come around, seeing the authentic happiness that radiated from the unconventional family. "I never thought I'd say this," John admitted, watching a group of teenagers setting up a basketball game, "but I'm grateful for that terrible misunderstanding. If I hadn't jumped to conclusions that day." Claire squeezed his hand. "We can't change but we chose to build something beautiful from it." The community center stood as testament to their transformation, a place where prejudice gave way to understanding, where wounds became wisdom. What had begun as John's gesture of atonement had evolved into their shared purpose. As the evening crowd began to gather, Michael ran ahead to greet friends, his confidence a miracle they witnessed anew each day. John and Claire followed more slowly, their fingers intertwined. "Rachel would be proud," Claire said softly, knowing how much her words meant to him. John's eyes glistened. "She would love you," he replied, "almost as much as we do." Together they walked toward the gathering, a family forged not by circumstance or convention, but by choice, choosing each other through judgment and fear, through healing and hope, through every tomorrow yet to come.